Welcome to Lectionary Call-In for Tuesday, August 25th of 2020, where two laypersons, a pastor and an academician, gather for about 55 minutes each week to discuss the Gospel Lectionary for the coming Sunday. And this Sunday is August 30th. Each Tuesday we call in from wherever we may be at 6:30 a.m. Eastern Time. And for our friend Charles Willard in Minnesota, it's 5:30 a.m. Our little team is working to be faithful to Lectionary Year A. And if you're studying the Gospel Lectionary this week, we hope this will provide areas of focus and reflection. Here's our approach. We work independently in advance of the call-in with some preliminary information on what the lead-off person would like to discuss, and then we develop perspectives, share, encourage, and challenge each other. And here are the folks joining us in today's discussion.
Bill Hall.
Sara Mickelson.
Charles Willard.
And I'm Don Upton. And today we're going to be looking at Matthew 16:21 through 28, and I'll be reading from the New Revised Standard Version. From that time on, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering at the hands of the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, God forbid it, Lord, this must never happen to you. When he turned and said to Peter, Get behind me, Satan, you are a stumbling block to me, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. Then Jesus told his disciples, If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit them if they gain the whole world but forfeit their life? Or what will they give in return for their life? For the Son of Man is to come with angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay everyone for what has been done. Truly I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. That's the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Well, before we get started with a few guiding questions, we'll turn to Charles Willard, who will tell us a little bit about what they would have heard in the first century. Hello, my friend.
Hi, Don. This is not quite what they would have heard, but the context in which they operated, and I just want to comment on the Jewish practice at that time of the Jubilee year and the sabbatical year. And as I describe this, you will, as I did and do each time I look at it again, how it remarkably describes the way that the Old Testament and taken into the New Testament tradition would have been about managing property and managing ownership as well as other aspects of their life. In this case, the two terms that were used or are used are the sabbatical year and the Jubilee year. The sabbatical year set it out that at the seventh year in the cycle, the seventh year, the fields would be left fallow and debts would be released. And in the Jubilee year, which would have been the 50th year in the cycle, there would be no agricultural work. All landed property would revert to the original owners, and slaves would be freed. And if you think about it, that is a remarkable set of principles and practices for a culture, in this case the Jewish culture in the earliest times, to practice equality, to practice ensuring that everybody was well taken care of and satisfied. And not surprisingly, because of the way the world works and the way people's minds work, there were ways found to circumvent some of these regulations. Before coming back to that, let me just say that right now, according to the current Jewish interpretation, the Jubilee year and the sabbatical year are not celebrated because they can only be celebrated when the whole of Israel is reunited, and that at least in terms of the majority of the Jewish population would be living where they did and were living at the time. Well, it would have been actually preceding the time of Jesus, because it would have been before the things got changed in the dramatic ways that they did. But if you are a landowner and you have the sabbatical year approaching or the Jubilee year approaching, that means that technically the land that you had and were claimed and used and managed as yours would be returned to its original owner. And a convenient way was found to circumvent that, whereby just before the end of the year preceding the sabbatical year and the Jubilee year, the land would be turned over to what I'll call a three-person holding company, and so that you had no land to return at the point that the Jubilee year began and the sabbatical year began, and then it came back to you shortly thereafter. So with that little historical background, let's go on to your other questions, Don. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. Came up with three questions for today, two big ones and a tag-along. And I'll just read them quickly and then we'll get started. The first one is, what difference does it make that Jesus rebukes Peter? Maybe I should read that differently. What difference does it make that Peter rebukes Peter, that Jesus rebukes Peter? And would this be a different engagement and Christ's response if Peter expressed only concerns in question? So I'll say again, what difference does it make? And the second question is, what is it to wish to come after me? Quote, wish to come after me, unquote. We spend a great deal of time on the denying self and taking up the cross part. But what's the predicate? What's this condition, wishing, as one of the translations, desiring to? I want to spend some time talking about that. And then finally, if there's some time, talking the third question about how do we deal with the first century concept of profit in commercial exchange language in verse 26. Because there is this metaphor that suggests an exchange or profit as a way to understand what Jesus is doing and how we follow or our desire. So let's start with the first question, Sarah, and I'll throw it your way. What difference does it make that Jesus rebukes Peter? Would this be a different engagement into Christ's response if Peter expressed only concerns and questions? What do you think?
I think this is an old dialogue between the tempter and the creator. The idea that last week Peter was the rock, the foundation. This week we're presented with a Peter who takes on the role of the tempter, or as one who assumes he knows what God wants. I don't know if you've ever been approached by somebody who assumed they knew what God wanted, but it's kind of frightening, especially if you're not in the information stream that they are. So I found some words in Brian Stofferson's Crossmarks article this week. I'm going to quote him. 3 times the word is used for actions of other people when they are rebuked. Peter rebukes Jesus in verses 16, or chapter 16, verse 22. The disciples rebuke those who are bringing children, which comes from chapter 19, verse 13. And the crowd rebukes the 2 blind men who are shouting at Jesus, which comes from chapter 20, verse 31. In all cases, the rebukers are criticized by Jesus for their actions. And this may be a warning to us about rebuking others and assuming that we know what God wants. Rock or stumbling block? I found that very interesting. The nature of Peter doesn't change. The results of Peter change. So foundation or an impediment to God's purposes, something that can be, the purposes of God can be built upon, or something that works as an impediment. And I thought about how, like the church, which on many occasions has moved of its own accord, assuming to know what God wants, and how often I have done the same thing. And it's essential that Christ rebukes Peter to me. Regardless of the fruit we've eaten or what we've borne witness to, I think there's a warning here. As human beings, are we prone to assume we know what God wants and what God designs? And I think, here is Peter throwing back onto Christ this notion of, that's not what Messiah does. You're not going to go to Jerusalem, and you're not going to you're not going to be beaten and suffer under the hand of the people in power. You're going to overthrow them. Or we don't need to go to Jerusalem. You should just stay up north, and we could preach and have healings, and people will love us. So there's that tension between wanting to understand the mind of God and a big warning label that says, my little brain cannot think like the mind of God. And I think that's what we're encountering here. I think it's essential that this sets up that story that's going to unfold in the second paragraph about losing life and about gaining salvation, things like that. So those are my answers, or my thoughts.
I wrote this down. I think you said it is essential that he rebuke. Did I get you right?
Yeah.
Thanks. Bill Hall, what do you think?
Well, interestingly, Sarah, I'll springboard off of that comment. It is essential. I think this is, and some of the commentaries make this point, this whole matter of Peter acknowledging Jesus as the Christ and then wanting to restrain or rebuke Jesus, I think is absolutely critical to the story and is a critical turning point. When I first read your question, Don, I remembered a quote. It may be a little indelicate for some people, but choose carefully what you will fall on your sword over. Okay? I think any of us who have some sense of decorum will choose carefully what we make an issue of. There are things we just let them go. I don't agree with that, or I don't like that. Jesus chose to make a big issue of this. And I'm trying to imagine taking this story at face value. As a leader, you commend someone, you get it. And then seemingly within minutes, wait a minute, you don't get it at all. Now, I'm not going to dwell on this, but I can imagine what that was like for Jesus to think, wow, one of my followers understands, wait a minute, no, he doesn't. It's almost as if Peter is denying his first affirmation. And several things to me emphasize how important this was to Jesus. First of all, this story in its essence is the same in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, at least by my reading. I printed out the parallels. I think the only difference is Luke leaves out the get behind me, Satan. But the sense of rebuke, I think, is just as strong in all three. So the fact that all three tell this story, to me, is significant. Assuming the scholars are correct, Mark was first. There are other things that Matthew and Luke don't repeat from Mark, but this one they choose to. And then some of the language. In Matthew and Mark, it says Jesus began to show his disciples, began to teach. That says to me, while it's told once here, I'm going to assume that there were other times Jesus said, let me remind you, and we don't have a record of that. But the language clearly indicates this was just the beginning of Jesus trying to teach that. Then in Luke, it says Jesus sternly ordered and commanded them that he had to suffer, be rejected, killed, raised. So that language underscores for me Jesus' sense of urgency that this be understood. And picking up on what I think was somewhat your theme, Sarah, Eugene Peterson in The Message titles this section, "You Are Not in the Driver's Seat." Okay, I think that is, in a sense, the message. It's Peter, and no, I would agree with your assessment, Sarah. It's we see at best in a mirror dimly, in a glass darkly. God is so much beyond what we can even imagine. Now, briefly, to try to link this to the here and now. This was suggested to me in Frederick Dale Bruner's commentary, where he makes an interesting analogy. We probably all know what Docetism was. It was an early heresy that denied the humanity of Jesus Christ. In other words, there were believers who say, I can understand Jesus was God, but you can't be God, and truly human. And Bruner says that in a sense, Peter is docetic. He will affirm Jesus as the Christ, the Messiah, but he doesn't want to accept Jesus as the suffering servant. In other words, he only wants a part of that dynamic and that tension. And it got me to thinking, how might we be docetic in that way today? And we all know we're in a tremendous crisis with the pandemic, with the economy, with education, and with the racial strife that's been highlighted yet again, sadly, in our nation. And here at where my wife and I live and at Palmacia Presbyterian Church, there are various groups and classes on Zoom trying to deal with particularly the racial issues. And we've read The Cross and the Lynching Tree by James Cone, White Fragility by Robert DiAngelo and Michael Dyson, The End of White Christian America by Robert Jones, and there's a current 2-week class. It met for the first time last week, a Zoom class at Palmacia, I'm Still Here by Austin Channing Brown, a black woman evangelical, and it's led by Kim Toole and Faye Rosef Baker. And a theme in that is how very, very difficult it is for any of us to deal with this conflict in a way that's effective. Various of the writers make the point that sometimes with the best of intentions, and I think Peter had good intentions. I don't see any indication that this was innocent. It was like, well, no, Lord, let me stop you there. Let me redirect you. So it's amazing how much hurt we can do with good intentions. That's one of the things that's coming true to me in these books that we're reading and struggling with. And I don't know the solution. I'm just saying that for me, this passage helps in that it says there are no easy solutions to this. There is no quick fix. It's only been 100 years since women in this country had to vote. And as a history major, I think, why don't we get it? Why do we keep making it so difficult to do justice and to love mercy and to walk humbly with our God? And what I'm saying is not an excuse for things going slow. It's an acknowledgement. I think the essence of humanity is we are slow to learn. And let me see if I can find the rep. Anyway, toward the end of Matthew, when the angels are appearing, they say to those seeing, understanding the resurrection, remember he told you that he had to suffer and die. Then they understood. This is toward the end of the Gospel of Matthew. And I think we're still learning that God is a God of grace, but we are human beings who make this journey as difficult as possible at times. So it's an encouragement that we keep walking into and facing into the pain of this journey seeking justice.
Thanks, Bill. So I've got Sara saying it's essential to the story, and Bill, you said it's critical to the story. Bill also said, what kind of road is paved with good intentions? And this has got good intentions in it. So I was thinking, all right, if it's essential, and I would say it's essential because it's about the separation of the divine from the human. And it's a big, big, big separation. So Peter plays a different kind of a rock role here, a rock in terms of this brutal, clear separation between the divine and the human. Because if it was just Peter saying, all right, I'm seeking understanding, explain this to me, I think Jesus would keep on teaching. So it's important that Peter's going, no, there's another way. It must not is very important to the response. The situation, right, Peter has been assessed, and Peter is speaking his gospel, his good news, which is there's a safe way. Peter's gospel is incrementalism and evasion, which I don't know about you. That sounds like the center of life to me. When I get up, a little evasion goes a long way. A little duck and cover goes a long way. And that's the gospel truth, isn't it? And I think this is Jesus saying, we're going to, is it Satan? Yes, because it requires a big division. So I think he's earnest too. And I also think he's fact-based because life teaches him that this is the gospel truth. And I'm intentionally throwing around that word gospel. There's good news here, Jesus. Have you heard the good news? Duck and cover, and we'll have a life ahead of us. So he's human problem solving. He's earnest. Even more, it's based, I believe, I'm with you, Bill. It's based on love and friendship, creative thinking, risk avoidance, but it's not divine. Even the love that Peter may have in his heart is not divine. It is not messiahship, and I think it's universal. And the rebuttal that Jesus makes is different. Because it dismisses Peter's role of avoiding the bad situation. It dismisses his calculation completely, and even dismisses love, friendship, evasion, all the safe things that we do. I've never read it as quite as a big a separation as I had yesterday. So I would say it's essential because it's about the separation of the divine from the human. And so thank you, Peter, for that. He wanted to go through an act of creation. Who's creating the Messiah here? Peter attempts to. Well, the next question, and I'll
let me interrupt just a minute.
Please, Charles.
Don, if you think about it, Peter had just been told by Jesus, at least according to Matthew's narrative, he'd just been told by Jesus this huge, not so much honor, but recognition of his place in the process. And I don't see why, now that I'm thinking about it, why I or anybody is so surprised that he would step in the way that he did, given the accolade and the acknowledgement and the power, the position he had been placed in by Jesus just before. And so what Jesus does is to step in and say, in effect, you got it wrong. And we are interpreting that as a huge rebuff, but it turns out it's a realignment. I don't see it as quite the dramatic, you got it all wrong. That's all I'm saying.
Thanks. Next question. What is it to wish to come after me? Of quote unquote. We spend a great deal of time on the denying self part and the taking up the cross part. But what about the predicate? What about this condition for action, the desire, the wish, which comes first, if you desire? What is that desire? Bill, what do you think?
My thoughts. Mark Davis notes for us that the verb here can mean to will, to have in mind, to intend. I looked it up in Art and Gendrick's English Greek dictionary, and they added words want, resolve, wish, so a variety of words in English to convey this. And in my mind, it reiterates for us that tension between God's will and human will, or some of the language you use, the sovereignty of God and free choice, free will of humans. I think those two are in tension. And for me, and maybe I just want to be simplistic, but I don't think so. What has worked in my life is to trust the presence of God and the, if you will, the sovereignty of God, the providence of God, and to know that my choices matter. Peter has just demonstrated that. Peter, as you say, Don, the bad place, the road to the bad place is paved with good intentions, okay? I reiterate. I don't think Peter was acting in malice. I think there was a sincere desire in his heart to try to change Jesus' message and mind. But to me, Scripture and our human lives are replete with examples that our choices matter, and that God, as represented by Jesus Christ, accepts the human capacity to make choices. The rich young ruler walked away sad because he had great wealth. Jesus didn't run after him. Jesus didn't soften his message. Talk about difficult messages. Sell all that you have, give it to the poor, and come and follow me. In some ways, just as demanding as accept that the Messiah will suffer and die. The elder brother in that story of the, quote, prodigal son is left standing outside the party. When we went over that, I said, we aren't told what his decision was. We may assume that he chose not to go in. The father in the story invited him and left him free to make his own choice. Come in and celebrate your rascal younger brother come into himself, or stay out here and be bitter and angry. And we recently went over the parable of the four soils, the different ways that people respond. So I don't know if I'm coming at this the way you intended with the question, but that's what I make of it, Don, that God is sovereign and I have the capacity to make choices and they matter. And sometimes with the best of intentions, I'm missing the mark or even hurting someone.
Thanks. I raised it because I was thinking about Peter's personal role in this, and I was trying to connect it to the earlier question where my reading was, can you shape the career of the Messiah, which is what he may be attempting to do out of love? And the answer is no. There's, you may not, I'm going to teach you, they may not be understanding. There's this chasm between the divine and the human. But I think there's an attempt to shape the career of the Messiah. It's kind of like, as we're recording this podcast, there are two hurricanes moving through the Gulf of Mexico, and they're cones, right? It's like we don't know where it's going. Can you attempt to know where it's going? Can you actually tell me today where they're going to land and how much water they're going to dump? Not really. We can forecast, you can predict, but I think a lot of scholars have struggled with saying this is a Jesus prediction about the passion. Not prediction, it's bullseye. And that isn't going to change in the pathway of the arrow. The pathway of this hurricane isn't going to be changed or altered by a human being like Peter. So I was thinking about it that way. And you mentioned Mark Davis. He, in terms of the desire, the wish, he said, consider it to will or to have in mind or to intend. And when I've read this, I always jump to the cross, take up the cross. It's almost like as a human, it's like I skip over the first part and go, if you want to take up the cross. Like, that's actually not what it says. It says, if you desire, if you want, if you will. And then I kind of make a footnote and go skip above and read what Peter said. If you desire, if to will, to have in mind, if you intend, if you wish, then you don't have a roadmap. Peter is told you cannot affect the career of the Christ you are going to follow. If, then this is what you're going to do. So it's opposed to anyone trying to shape the path of the divine or the desires of the situation of the Christ, then deny oneself, be more about, I think, Peter. Denying oneself, if I connect it to what Peter said, is deny the entire systems that you are connected to. Deny the affairs of the heart. Denying yourself, if it's really about Peter, and not just everyone, but look at Peter. Deny oneself means you are not dependent on those systems and you have no roadmap. It's your desire that will lead you to the roadmap. And so this for me, a breakout over the weekend where this is a piece about desire, wanting, to willing, to have in your mind, wanting to follow, which is something that's vested in human beings. And that's a happy thought. How about you, Sarah? What do you think?
Oh, I think there's a big difference between wishing and doing. So in my thinking about this question, I think that we are, and Caroline Lewis in her 2017 Dear Working Preacher article threw up this phrase, and I really loved it. We're at an intersection between the human road and the divine road. And almost on cue, Jesus goes, you're going to be forced to make a decision. You're going to be put in a position, if not now, then shortly, between what you would like to see happen and what God would have happen. So that the cross is not just a symbol for what we believe, but also a moment in which you continually choose what to believe and who to follow. A crossroads that's perpetual. And I think that the language that's used in the book of Mark, when Mark tells us this story, I'm going to liken it to what Matthew says in verse 21. Jesus began to teach that he would have to go to Jerusalem. But I think what Mark says is not quite the beauty of what Matthew says. And in Matthew's gospel, he says, Jesus began to show. I think there's a big difference between teaching and showing. And having some roots in adult learning theory, adults seem to do better to learn by doing. We're doozers, to quote Jim Henson. We're doozers. We want to do it. We want to understand it by doing the kinesthetic movement of action. And so I think there's a difference, or a wish is to look down the road and think wistfully what could happen. Action is following down the road and going with. And almost to the point of Ruth going with Naomi. Not knowing that it's going to benefit her, not thinking it's going to turn out in my favor, but Ruth goes with Naomi. And I think we see this often. I mean, we see it played out in good literature. We see it, there's always a sidekick, right? There's always Samwise Gamgee to Frodo. There's always the connection between someone who will believe in you and follow you and be your partner and be your sidekick. Or you have that opportunity to say, no, I think we should go a different way. And I think there's that intentional struggle in humanity between the divine and the human. And in human terms, we can look at divine and wish we could go that way. Oh, I wish I could help. Oh, I wish I could do that. Oh, I really wish we had fill in the blank. Or there's the how do we get there? And it's an action. So there's a very big difference between inaction, wishing, and action, which is following. And I think that that's really what this is about. And I think Jesus lays it down and says, if you really wish to follow me, here's what you have to do.
Before I go to the third question, Charles, and I'm going to start with you there, do you have any follow-up on the second one?
No, I'm fine.
Thank you. Question 3. How do we deal with the first century concept of profit in commercial exchange language in verse 26? Again, a metaphor about profit, exchange, transaction, dropped right into the middle of this. And Charles, could you open up this conversation?
I'm going to go in a very different direction, so probably I should have started out when you asked me before if I had anything to say following what Sara said, which it really does follow that up. I want to take you back to an old story that we have, because as I was looking at this, I'm wondering to myself, I've been wondering to myself again, when you look at these things closely, then you see things you hadn't seen before, even though you've been looking at them for, in my case, many, many, many decades. And it is the question you turn to me, Don, what will it profit them if they gain the whole world but forfeit their life? And what will they give in return for their life? And I've been asking myself, what does it mean to give something in return for your life? Or what would you give your life for? And I was taken back to a story called Christmas Carol. And I want to remind you of several individuals in that story and ask you to think about what they were giving and what they did. And the examples I have are Ebenezer Scrooge, Jacob Marley, Bob Cratchit, Fred, and Tiny Tim. And if I put myself in the role of Ebenezer Scrooge, he worked hard, and I don't think that Scrooge was an unjust or did tricky things in order to make money. But I think his entire focus was on making money. And as I think about Scrooge, who among all these people had, by that time, certainly accumulated, because of his hard work and relentless devotion to making money, he had accumulated a lot of money. But if you think about the home to which Scrooge returned after one of his early scenes where he had left work and gone home, and he went in, my thought was, that was a miserable place to live. And when he went upstairs and sat down to his supper, what kind of a meal was that? And what kind of a life was that he had, that he had gained and had built with the results of his work? His relentless negotiations with his buyers of the grain that he had bought and stored. And yet that's what he had given his life for. And you have to ask, if you think about the reality of Scrooge's life, to what end? To what goal? Jacob Marley is he is the one that I, in some sense, feel the most remorse for. What Jacob Marley got to do as a result of some relationship, some favor in the afterworld, when he was spending his life doing the things that he should have been doing when he was alive and didn't do. That's why he had that huge set of heavy boxes that were anchored to his body, and yet he was given an opportunity to make a gift to his old friend Ebenezer Scrooge, who, is by his own witness, didn't think too much of Marley's business acumen, but nevertheless, Marley was gracious and he gave Scrooge this opportunity to save his life, which fortunately Scrooge finally did. Bob Cratchit was the guy who was doing nice things to people all the time, to his children, to his pastor, to people he met along the way. Fred was like Bob Cratchit in another way, generous to others, open, kind even to his uncle. And Tiny Tim, as he said in his statement toward the end, God bless us, everyone. So there's a range of human emotions and human possibilities there that I think open up to us, what one can give his life for. And Scrooge made the right decision. And I guess I'm going to stop by saying, we can only hope that as we are, as most of us probably are, Scrooges in our life, that we have an opportunity to make the right decision.
Thanks, Charles. Well, one of the reasons I was raising the transaction piece was, first I was thinking about how does that play into the rebuking of Peter and the separation of the human and the divine. And I was reading some history about the creation of wealth and commerce. And in the history of private life, from pagan Rome to Byzantium, they talk about in the Roman system how citizens were actually divided into orders based on wealth and their transactions. And that commerce was a means to an end to become rich. I'm quoting them. A means to an end. So for the gospel, I'll say it was a means to an end to become, and then fill in the blank. And I'm excited about the metaphor because it's a shadow. It's a faint shadow of what Jesus is trying to get across. Because there is a human truth in this, that you create, through transactions, the ability to become something different. It's kind of a Peter gospel. We can evade this. You can remain the great physician. You can still feed the people. A piece of Christ in a different way. We think a piece of Christ is a piece of the whole, a piece of grace, a piece of. But he said, "I'd like this piece, please," and that's it. I think I'm looking at the transaction and what does it profit, thinking about a metaphor that really sticks, because the truth is, in the first century and right now, that wealth creation and transaction is on a road to something that. This is just for the metaphor, creates character, dignity, power, opportunity, value, safety, health. I think that's the world of Peter. So you create wealth to become, and transformation is possible. It's anti-gospel, but it's the best possible metaphor I could think of to make the point. What about you, Bill? What do you think?
I see we're getting close on time. I'll be brief. Mark Davis translates this verse as, "For what will it profit a person if one should gain the whole world, but one's soul be damaged? Or what will one give in return for one's soul?" That phrase, "one's soul be damaged," to me is is evocative. We talk about losing our life, but damaging the essence of who I am, which is what I take that to be. The other thought is, it seems to me, Don, and I was intrigued by your question because I hadn't thought of this language of commerce and profit and so forth. But you mentioned the word commercial exchange language. It seems to me there is, in fact, an exchange involved in everything we do. Now, I didn't double check myself, but I believe the English word decision literally means to cut away, de-size. If when I made a decision to participate in this blog this morning, which means I'm not doing other things that I could be doing. Every decision is a decision to do one thing and not to do others, or any other decision that we make. So I think there is an exchange. I'm investing my time in this blog, gladly so, hopefully profitably so, but at the expense of doing other things. And when I think about it, I'm comfortable with that. But it reminds me of the importance of deciding. And I think that's what Jesus is saying to Peter. If you persist in insisting that I can't suffer, your decision is cutting you away from really experiencing me, Christ, in my fullness, the suffering servant part that I mentioned earlier. So that's what I would offer on this.
Thank you. And we've got about 7 minutes left. Sarah, I'll go to you.
Well, we can choose the kingdom of me, or we can choose the kingdom of Christ, the kingdom of heaven. And we will work toward what we want. If we choose the kingdom of heaven, we're going to follow, looking for ways we can bring justice about, looking for ways we can be merciful to each other, looking for ways to assist someone else in the creation of the kingdom of heaven. In the kingdom of me, it's all about what's best for me and mine. Mine, mine, mine. Some seagulls do that really well. And I think that's really the crux of this, to understand Christ and his glory. We have to follow. We can't be about ourselves and choosing that which is all about me. That's all.
Thanks. Well, Charles, you shaped that conversation with those choices of the Christmas Carol. Anything to wrap up before we say goodbye?
No, thank you.
Thank you. And for those listening in or watching on Zoom, Palmacia Presbyterian Church is at 3501 West San Jose Street. That's in Tampa, Florida. And for more information, you can go to palmacia.org. That's PALMACEIA.org. And at that site, especially if you're listening during pandemic, are other resources, other discussions of Scripture, often the same Scripture we're on, lectionary, worship, great music, multiple services, all kinds of discussions and reflections. So we commend that to you, especially if you're in a quarantine or lockdown situation. And you are always welcome. And we'll see you next time.